In the last section of this course, we developed a basic web page using tables and inline style attributes. You might recall we styled table borders, fonts, headings, and background colors. You may have noticed this process was quite inefficient. We repetitively had to keep placing the same style attributes over and over again for any document element that we wanted to apply a style to. For example, if we wanted to change the font color and typeface of text in 3 separate areas, we would need to change the font face and color attribute in each instance. This made the process inefficient and the code quite lengthy. Secondly, when we put the web page together, we put the contents in tables using rows and columns. This helped make the page look organized, but there really wasn't too much flexibility in the positioning of our content. We were more or less limited to left, center, or right alignment attributes. More so, we were unable to stack multiple objects on top of one another. For example, if we inserted an image into a table cell, we could not place any other object underneath or on top of that image, a concept known as layering. In this section of the course, we're going to explore the world of CSS, cascading style sheets. CSS helps eliminate all of these issues and makes the development process much more flexible, efficient, and browser-friendly. Once you start developing sites using CSS, you'll likely never use table-based website layouts again. This doesn't mean you'll never use tables. Tables are still an excellent way to lay out tabular data, but you won't be using them for layout and styling your website elements and content. So what exactly is CSS? Think of a cascading style sheet as a list of style rules that you can refer to at any time to format your text, images, tables, and just about any other object on your web page. These style rules are entirely user-defined, meaning you make them based on your needs. They are highly customizable and easy to use. Furthermore, you can link each page on your website to a single style sheet and update hundreds or even thousands of pages simultaneously. At this time, you might be wondering what a cascading style sheet looks like. Well, we touched on it in the beginning of the last section. If you recall, we introduced the style tags and created a single style rule to define the web page text color. If you've forgotten, then don't worry. We'll be working extensively with style sheets during this section. The syntax for CSS is different than HTML markup and consists of 3 parts: a selector, a property, and a value. The selector is the HTML element that you want to apply the style to. Let's take a look at an example. Open the file in your Downloads folder corresponding to this lecture. With the file open, let's preview it in our web browser to see what the original looks like. We can see that there are 3 headings and 3 paragraphs. Now let's create a style sheet contained within our head tag. Let's create a style rule that changes the background color of our web page to pink. For this, we will need to create the following style rule inside of our style sheet, so in between our open and close style tag. In this case, the body is the selector and the property is the background. Once you've inserted the style rule, save your document and preview it in your web browser. You will notice the page's background is now pink. Each selector can have multiple properties. For example, if you wanted to change both the color of the background and the default font for the web page to Arial, the CSS style rule would now look like this. Let's save our page and we'll refresh the contents in our web browser, and we can now see that all the font on the page has changed to Arial. If you only wanted to apply another rule to certain selectors, you can do that as follows. Let's say we wanted to change all the headers, all the H1 tags in our document to a different font color and a different font family. In this case, any block of text within H1 tags will have the color red and the font family Georgia. So let's go ahead and add the H1 tag around our first heading, heading 1. So I'll start with the open H1 tag and the close H1 tag. Now let's go ahead and save and take a look in our browser. We can see that the heading is now much larger and a different color. The font face is also different. So just as we intended. Selectors can also be combined. So say for example, not only did we want to change the H1 headers to this font and color, we also wanted to do the same for H2, H3, and H4. So let's go ahead and apply the H2 tags to our second heading. And the H3 tag to our third heading. Now we'll save our file. And there it is. Now we can see that that style rule was applied to heading 1, 2, and 3. There are three types of CSS styles: internal, inline, and external styles. This HTML page illustrates an example of an internal style sheet and inline styles. An internal style sheet simply means that the style sheet is contained in the same HTML document in which the styles are used. Here, we've defined a style sheet in between our head tags, with three rules that will format the body, the header 1 tags, and the paragraph elements. This is an example of an internal style sheet. We can easily convert this into an external style sheet by placing our style rules in a CSS file and linking to it. To do so, cut the style rules out and delete the style tags. Now create a new file and paste the style rules into it. Now save this file as mystyles.css. You can use any name you want, that's just an example. Make sure that the extension is a .css file, otherwise this will not work. Now I'm going to switch back to the original file, and we're going to link to our external style sheet using this line of code. We can confirm that it worked by previewing the file in our web browser. And you can see that all the styles are still applied. In addition to internal and external style sheets, we also have inline CSS. With inline CSS, the style rules are added directly inside the element. For example, here we have a paragraph element with two inline rules. Style is equal color blue and font size 35. We can see in our web browser that the style rules have been applied to this paragraph of text. The text size is 35 pixels and the color is blue. Using inline rules is normally not a good practice because it's inefficient. If we used inline rules on all our pages, we would need to individually open each one and edit the rule. Inline rules also cause unnecessary repetition and increase the length of the HTML code. When possible, use external style sheets. When working with colors in CSS, it's important to know that all colors displayed on the screen are produced by combining red, green, and blue, also known as the RGB color spectrum. We can set colors in CSS using color names, RGB color codes, or hexadecimal values. This HTML document provides an example of all three. Our style sheet has three rules that will apply font coloring to any H1, H2, and H3 elements. The H1 style rule uses a color name, in this case red. The H2 style rule uses a hexadecimal code which represents light blue. The H3 style rule uses an RGB color code that represents a light purple color. We've referenced each of these rules in our HTML body, so H1, H2, and H3. We can see in our web browser, this is the end result. We can see that each style rule has been successfully applied. So H1 is red, H2 is light blue, and H3 is light purple. In order to get color codes and hexadecimal values, we can use a number of free online tools. Colorpicker.com is one such example. Here, we can browse through a color palette and retrieve the corresponding code values. If I wanted the code of this green, you simply click on it and you can see the hexadecimal value here, and you can see the corresponding RGB values here. And you can do that with any color in the spectrum. The class selector allows you to apply specific styles to an HTML element from CSS rules defined in your style sheet. Think of it as setting up a catalog of different styles in your style sheet and referencing these styles when you need to apply them to your HTML elements. Let's take a look at an example. In order to create a class, we need to define it in our sheet. We'll go ahead and create one class. We'll call this class blue bold text. This is the syntax for defining a class. And you'll notice that the class begins with a period, followed by the class name, and you can give it any name you like. We'll create a couple of other classes that we'll be using as well. So for the class definitions, we have a large font size, the color is green, and this text will be bold. And just one more class. This class will underline any text we apply it to. So we now have 3 classes created. Now let's apply one of the classes to the text contained in this column. Applying a class is easy. We just need to call the class by its name. And so for this block of text, we'll apply the blue bold text class. Now let's go ahead and save our file and preview it just to make sure that it worked. And so you can see that this class, the class we created, has now been applied to all the text in the column we'd applied the class to. Now say for example we wanted to apply a different class to just these 2 words, lorem ipsum. In order to do that, we need to use the span tags. So we create open a span tag, and a span can have a class as well. So for this, we'll use the large green text class. Just make sure there's no spelling mistakes. And we need to close the span tag. Okay, so you can use the span tags when there's no inline element to apply the class to. So let's save our file and preview it. So now we have these two words that are a different class than the text, than the remaining text in that paragraph. Now say for example, in addition to the large green text class, we also want to apply the underline class. Well, you just make a space and type the second class you want to apply. Now save your file, and we'll refresh our document, and we can see that the underline class has now been applied to this text as well. Divs are yet another very important part of CSS development and are represented by the div tags. In order to understand the function of a div, let's refer back to the web page we developed using tables. When we created the web page, all the content, including text and images, were nested in table cells. As we determined, we did not have much flexibility in the positioning of these objects within the cell, or the table itself for that matter. Divs are similar to table cells in that they contain content such as text, images, or media objects. The key difference is that divs offer a much higher degree of customization in formatting and positioning. This includes things like rounded corners, transparency, layering, and complete flexibility in positioning down to the pixel. Before we begin this tutorial, please open your text editor and set up your basic HTML page structure as shown. Save the file as div.html on your computer. Now let's go ahead and create a div in our document and fill it in with some basic text content. We will create the div in between our open and close body tags. The open div tag requires a closing div tag. The content in between the opening and closing div tag will be displayed in your browser's content area. Now let's go ahead and save this file and preview this in our web browser. So here we can see the line of text we inputted into the div. You can think of it as a line of text contained within a single table cell. If this were a table, the table would have one column and one row, equating to one cell. We haven't done any CSS formatting to this div, and we'll be exploring that in the next lecture. Now that we've created our first div, we can explore CSS declarations that allow us to customize the look and positioning of our div. The first item of discussion is CSS IDs. CSS IDs are similar to classes. They are defined in your style sheet and referenced in your HTML elements. The primary difference is that once an ID has been referenced in an HTML element, it cannot be used again within the same HTML file. You might recall that when we created classes, we could use that class as many times as we needed for multiple HTML elements. This is not the case with IDs. IDs are generally used for layout elements that will only be needed once. A great place to use IDs is for defining CSS rules for divs. Divs are considered layout elements because they contain content, such as graphics, text, and media that make up our web page. Each div normally requires its own unique set of attributes. One example is the position attribute. In most cases, when designing CSS layouts, you wouldn't have two divs in the same location on the web page. For this reason, we would need two IDs that define unique position attributes for each div. Let's create a style rule for our div before applying it to the div we created earlier. In order to create a style rule for our div and reference it as an ID, we need to declare it in the style sheet. Let's create our style tags and define the ID. We'll call this ID div1. And when defining an ID, you need to place the number sign in front of the name. This particular ID now contains 4 style definitions. The div will be 80% of the width of our content area. It will have a 3-pixel black border. The background of the div will be yellow, and any text contained in the div will be blue. And we'll also mention again that the style rule for our ID reference begins with a number sign, unlike our classes which began with a period. With our ID created, we can now reference this ID in our div tag. So we'll go ahead and apply the ID here. We need to reference the ID by name, and since we named it div1, we'll plug in div1. Now let's go ahead and save our file and preview it in our web browser to see the final result. So here we can see we have a 3-pixel black border. The background of the div is yellow. The text contained within the div is blue. And the div itself is 80% of the width of the full content area. In addition to referencing an ID in our div tag, we can also create a class and apply it to the div as well. Let's say we wanted all the text in our div to be underlined. Well, first, we need to create the class. So to remember that your class starts off with a period, followed by the class name, and this is the CSS syntax for underlined text. Next, we'll apply this class in our div tag. So just make a space, type class equals, and then in your quotations, put the name of the class, underline. Now we can save our file, preview it again, and we can now see that the class has been applied and all the text within our div is underlined. Now that we have an understanding of IDs, classes, and divs, we can explore some of the style definitions that allow us to customize the look of our HTML elements. We'll begin with margins. Margins allow you to add spacing around the perimeter of your element. A margin can be added to any one side or a combination of sides. Let's add some margins to the div we created in the last lecture. In order to see the bottom margin, we will need to place a line of text underneath the div. So enter a line of text, and you can enter this line of text in a new div underneath your original. Now to apply the margin, we need to add the margin definition to our div1 ID. This is because we're adding the margin to div1. To add a margin, simply type in margin, colon, and then the amount of the margin. We'll go with a 10 pixel margin to begin with, and we'll increase it to show you the difference. So let's take a look at what a 10 pixel margin looks like. So we've saved our file, and I'm just going to preview it in the web browser. This is the margin at 10 pixels. So a 10 pixel margin has been added to the top, the bottom, the left, and the right. Let's go ahead and increase the amount of the margin to see the difference. I'm going to go from a 10 pixel margin to a 30 pixel margin. And just save. And refresh the page. So you can see that it increases the amount of margin by 20 pixels. Now say for example, we didn't want to add a margin on every side. We only wanted to apply the margin to the bottom and left side. Well, in that case, our style definition would look like this. This instructs the web browser to put a 0 pixel margin on top. The second value is a 0 pixel margin on the right. The third represents the bottom margin, so that's 30 pixels on the bottom. And the last value is the left margin. So that's 30 pixels on the left side of the div. So I'll save that. And actually, I'll just increase it to 50 so we can actually see the difference. I'll save that and refresh the browser. Okay, so now we have no top margin, we have no right margin, but our left and bottom margin has increased. Padding creates spacing between the perimeter of an HTML element and the content contained within it. In this tutorial, we'll be adding padding around the text contained within our div. Similar to margins, padding can be added around all 4 sides of an element or only specified sides. First, we will add padding around all sides. To do that, type the following style definition in your div1 ID. This will add a 10 pixel gap between the text in our div to the perimeter of the div. So let's go ahead and save the file and take a look at it. So we can see that we have a 10 pixel gap around our text right up to the perimeter of the div. I'm going to increase this amount of the padding so we can better illustrate this example. So I've saved the file and I'm just going to refresh. And we can see this is now a 20 pixel padding around the text. Now let's add padding to only the top and left side of the text. To do this, enter the following values. We'll add 30 pixels on top, 0 on the right, 0 on the bottom, and 30 pixels on the left. So save the file, and I'll refresh. So now we have 30 pixels on the top, 30 pixels on the left, and 0 on the bottom and right. CSS allows many different text formatting options. We've worked with some of them in the past, but others will be new to you. We'll go through a number of them in this lecture. To begin, please open the exercise file located in the Downloads folder corresponding to this lesson. Once open, let's preview this file in our web browser. We can see that the file consists of a number of paragraphs of text. Each block of text is contained within an open and close div tag. We also have a style sheet that contains a number of classes relevant to text formatting. The classes are contained within the open and close style tags. We'll go through each definition contained within the classes to explain what they're used for. The first class contains a color style declaration. We've worked with this in the past. The color declaration will change the color of the text it is applied to. Let's go ahead and apply this class to the first paragraph. Now save the file and preview it in the browser. So we can see here that the first paragraph has changed to the color red. The next two classes are almost identical to the first. They are color declarations. The difference is these two declarations use color codes. The first declaration uses a web color code, and the second uses an RGB color code. If you're unsure what this means, please review our lecture on color codes. Let's go ahead and update our class reference to the second class. So text color 2. Now save the file and just refresh your browser, and we can see that the color is now green for the first paragraph. As you probably guessed, the third class will do the same thing. We'll just save that and refresh the browser. And we can see that the text color is now purple. The next class has a letter spacing declaration. This allows us to adjust the amount of space between each character in a word, sentence, or block of text. This declaration has a value of 10 pixels. You can increase this value for more spacing or decrease it for less. Let's apply this class to the second paragraph of text. I'll just copy it so that way it ensures I don't make any spelling mistakes when I'm entering it in. And then save the file. And I'll refresh the browser. So now we can see we have a 10 pixel space in between each character in this block of text. In addition to letter spacing, we also have the word spacing declaration. This allows us to adjust the spacing between words rather than letters. Let's apply this this class to the third paragraph. We'll save the file and reload our browser. So now we can see the 10 pixel spacing between each word in this paragraph. The next class we have is the text align declaration. This allows us to align our text using left, right, center, or justify as the value. The default is left, so let's go ahead and change this to center and see what happens. We'll also need to apply this class to any one of the paragraphs. Then we'll save it and refresh the browser. So we can see the alignment is now centered. Next, we have the text declaration. We've worked with this one before. The value of this declaration is currently underlined. Other possibilities include overline, line through, and blink. You can replace the underline with each one and apply the class to a paragraph to see the results. We also have the text transform declaration, which allows us to change text to capitalized letters. You can also change the value to lowercase by replacing capitalized with lowercase. So we'll go ahead and apply this class. Now we'll just refresh our browser. There's only a couple of capital letters in this paragraph. So you can see that they've switched to lowercase now. And this time I'll change it to capitals and refresh. And we can see that the first letter of each word is now capitalized. If you want to change all the letters to uppercase characters, then you can use the uppercase declaration. And now all the characters are uppercase. In this lecture, we'll explore the font property to set various style declarations for text, such as font family, style, size, and line height. We'll be working on the same file we worked with in the last lecture. To begin, we need to create a class that will be used to change the font style of a paragraph of text in our body below. Let's call this style text style. We'll create each style declaration, then explain what the style declarations are used for. The first declaration is font family. This allows us to change the font face of the text. The reason we specify a font family is because your website visitor's browser may not support the first font specified, in this case, Verdana. If not, the browser will use the second font, and so on, if you have additional fonts specified. The next declaration is font size. As you guessed, this allows us to change the size of the font. There are many possible values, ranging from extra extra small to extra extra large. Font style allows us to make the text italic or oblique, or normal. Line height allows us to change the spacing between each line of text in a paragraph. The default line height in most browsers is about 110 to 120%, so any value above this amount will increase the spacing, and any value below it will decrease it. Let's save our file and preview it in our web browser to see what the paragraph looks like without the class applied. So we can see that this is the default style. And now we'll go ahead and add the class we just created. Save the file. And I'll just refresh the web browser. And as we can see here, this paragraph, the font style has changed to reflect the class that we added to the paragraph. In this lecture, we'll explore how to add borders around an element. We'll start by creating a class with commonly used border style declarations. We'll call this class myBorder. The first declaration, border, is used to specify where the border will be applied and at what thickness. The thickness is stated in pixels. At the moment, we have a 4-pixel thick border. For a border only at the top of an element, we would use the border top declaration. Border bottom, border right, and border left are also other values that can be used. If we leave it as just border, as we have now, the border will be applied to all 4 sides. Next, we have the border color. This will be the color of the border itself. The color value can be represented by a color name, such as red, green, or blue, a hexadecimal number, as we currently have, or an RGB value. We can also create a border style using the border style declaration. There are several possible styles. At the moment, we've used dashed, which will create a dashed line border effect. Let's go ahead and apply this class to one of our paragraphs. We'll apply it to the first paragraph. So make a space after your first class and paste the second, myBorder. Now we'll save our file and preview it in our browser. So here we can see we have the dashed border, which has been applied to the first paragraph. In this lecture, we'll work with adding backgrounds to elements using the background property. To begin, we'll need to create a file with our basic HTML structure as shown here. Once you've created this file, save it as backgrounds.html. We'll be applying a background to a div. So let's go ahead and create our div tags in the body. We'll also need to create an ID selector so we can reference the ID that will contain the background declarations for this div. Let's set that up in our style sheet. So we'll create a style sheet with the open and close style tags. Now let's insert our ID. We will call it div1. Now create the following declarations for this ID. Most of these declarations should look familiar. The background color declaration allows us to set a background color to an element. The value can be a color name, as we have here, the color blue. It can be a hexadecimal number or an RGB color code, all three of which we've worked with in the past. Let's apply this ID to our div and preview it in our web browser. So save the file and preview it. As you can see, our div has a blue background as defined in the background color declaration. In addition to a color background, we can also use an image as a background. To do this, we need to use the background image declaration. We'll use the image stored in the downloads folder corresponding to this lecture. The image is a JPEG file, and its dimensions are 204 pixels in width by 204 pixels in height. To add the background image, we'll need to replace the background color declaration with background image. Now we need to indicate the path for this background image. And the image is in the same folder as this HTML document, so all I have to do is plug in the name of the file. Now save your file again and preview it just to see the change. This is what your div should look like after adding the background image declaration. We can see that the background image was applied to our div and also repeated, so it fills the entire div with the specified image. Let's say we only wanted to repeat the background horizontally or along the x-axis. To do this, we can use the background repeat declaration. This declaration, repeat x, as the value, will repeat the background only along the x-axis, as you can see here. We can do the same vertically by changing the declaration to repeat y instead of repeat x. If we didn't want the background to repeat at all, we would use the no repeat declaration. And this is the actual image, and the background here is not repeating. Now say we wanted to specify the position of the background image placement. We can do that using the background position declaration. We'll set the position as center. And we can see that the background now no longer repeats and is also situated in the center of our div. There are also several other position values you can use, as shown. At this point, you can go ahead and try different combinations of these declarations to see the effect each one will have on the end result. We can define the level of transparency or opaqueness of an image using the opacity declaration. Before we begin, set up your basic HTML structure and save the file as opacity.html. Once you've set up your basic HTML structure, create an open and close div tag within your body tags. Now we'll insert an image into this div. Once the image is inserted, we can adjust the opacity of the image. The image can be found in the Downloads folder corresponding to this lecture. Next, we need to set up our style sheet. Inside the style sheet, enter the following declaration. This is the opacity style declaration, and the 0.4 will set the opacity of any image in our document to 40%. Let's go ahead and take a look. Save the file and preview it in your web browser. And this is the image with the opacity set at 40%. Let's set it at 90% to see the difference it makes. And that's the opacity at 90%. We can add additional effects using the opacity declaration as well. Let's create a hover effect so that the image changes from 40% to 100% opacity when your mouse is hovered on top of the image. To do that, add the following declaration. Also change the original opacity declaration back to 40%. Now save your file and refresh your browser. And as you can see, when we hover our mouse over the image, it changes to 100% opacity, and when we remove the mouse, it changes back to 40% opacity. In this lecture, we'll be placing text on an image using CSS as shown in this example. Here, you can see we have a div that contains a background image. We also have a div that contains a semi-transparent text box with some text. In order to do this, we'll be working with nested divs. A nested div is a div that is contained within another. The div that contains the nested div is known as a container. To begin, create a basic HTML page structure and save the file as imagetext.html. The files for this lesson are located in your Downloads folder. Now let's create a style sheet with two ID selectors. One ID for the div that will have the background image, and the second for the div that will contain the black text box. We'll call the first ID selector background. We'll start with the background image declaration. We'll set the path to the txtbg.jpg file. And again, this file is located in your downloads folder. Once you have that declaration complete, also put in a padding declaration of 40 pixels. The padding declaration will add a 40 pixel space between the text box perimeter and the background perimeter, as shown here. That's this space right over here. Now we'll create the second ID selector. And we'll call this text box. We can set the width to auto. So it takes up the full length of its container, which will be the background div. Set the height to 100 pixels. Opacity will set to 80%. Background color is black. And the padding will be 10 pixels. This will create some spacing from the text inside the div to the perimeter of the black text box. You can see we have a space here. Lastly, we need to create one class, and this will just make our text color white. With our style sheet complete, we can create our divs in the body, between the body tags. The first div will be our background. So we'll reference the background ID. Inside the background, we'll be nesting the text box div. And inside the text box div, we'll be nesting a div that will contain the text. So we'll attach the text class to this div. Okay, now you'll just need to type some text inside this div. You can either copy a block of text or you can type your own. I'll just paste in a block I have here. So with that created, we can save our file. And let's go ahead and preview it. And so there we have it. The background image, the text box, and the white text contained within the text box. You can also see that the background of the text box is semi-transparent. We can control the width and height of an element using the width and height declarations. For the purpose of this lesson, we'll apply various width and height attributes to a div to see the effect. To start, open the HTML file in your Downloads folder corresponding to this lesson. The file contains a div in the body and one ID selector, div1, which has been applied to the div. Let's preview this file in our web browser to see what it looks like. Here we can see the div is 100% width of the content area and 500 pixels in height, with a blue background. If we scale the browser window up and down, we can see that the div expands and contracts to suit the size of the content area. It is always 100% of the content area's width. CSS allows different values to be attributed to the width and height declaration. We'll begin with minimum width. Min width can be used to specify the minimum amount of width an element must be. Since the width is currently set to 100% of the content area, it will automatically stretch and contract with the browser window, as we saw previously. If we wanted to maintain a minimum fixed width of at least 600 pixels, we can apply the following declaration. Now, after you've saved your file, let's go ahead and refresh our browser. And this time you'll see that when the browser window becomes smaller than 600 pixels, we get the horizontal scroll bars. This is because this div, its minimum width must be 600 pixels. It will not go below that value. In addition to min width, we also have maximum width or max width. So if we set the maximum width to 800 pixels, now save the file and we refresh the browser, you'll notice that the div now does not go beyond 800 pixels. So we have a minimum width set at 600 and a maximum of 800. Width can also be set to auto. So let's go ahead and set the width declaration value to auto. And this will make the width of the element automatically sized to its container. In this case, the div is not nested in another div, so it will expand to the full size of the browser's content area. Now we do have to remove the max width declaration in order for the auto declaration to work. So once you've saved, refresh your browser, and you'll notice that it now scales to the full width of the content area automatically. Similar to min width and max width, we also have min height and max height. These values can be stated in pixels or percentage, just like they can with min width and max width. An important difference between the width and height declarations is that setting the height to 100% will not result in your div occupying 100% of your browser's content area. So for example, if we were to change the height here to 100% and refresh our content area, refresh our browser, you'll notice that the div disappears altogether. In order to do this, we need to use the VH unit that's available with recent versions of CSS. VH, which stands for viewport height, ensures that the element stretches to the full height 100% of any device's viewport. So let's go ahead and change the height value to 100 VH. Save the file. And when we refresh, you can see that it is now 100% of the height and 100% of the width.